The resolution for today is the United States federal government should end the war on terror. Observation 1 is a resolutional analysis where we're going to define all definitions as contextual, meaning that all the definitions are pretty straightforward, meaning the war on terror is for what had happened after the 9/11 attacks, unless there are any questions. All right, sounds great. Then observation 2 is the background. First is that war on terror was a campaign developed by the Bush administration in response to the 2001 attacks. The 2 under this is the term war on terror was recently renamed. The A point under this is that in March 2009, the Pentagon reported that the phrase and senior administration officials agreed that they asked for all of us to use Overseas Contingency Operation, also known as the OCO, instead of the war on terror. So for this reason, we will be referring to Overseas Contingency Operation. The third point under this is that the Overseas Contingency Operation has actually increased drone strikes, also known as UAVs, which is unmanned air vehicles. The A point under this is that according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, 409 drone strikes have been carried out under the Obama's administration's OCO, killing at least 2,100 people, innocent people for that matter, compared to the 53 drone strikes carried out under the Bush administration, only killing less than 400 individuals. The B point under this is that one civilian death or injury is enough to dramatically alter family lives, causing instability the moment that they are attacked. They feel instability within their families, meaning one individual will not be able to actually go to work. So therefore, this means that less family members will be able to actually go to work and provide for their families, such as food and water. Also, these infrastructures are often obliterated along with the drone strikes, such as hospitals, office buildings, and schools, according to the New York Times. The C point under this is that drone strikes cause large tension in communities where civilians increase psychological tension, such as stress and anxiety, meaning they're unable to function as fluidly as before because of the amount of stress that was implemented on them. The fourth point under this is that OCOs have actually increased drone strikes, which actually increased radical groups. The A point under this is that UCLA analysts say these drone strikes worsen asymmetrical violence by radicalizing local communities. The B point under this is that a radical group has actually killed a local who was saving water from a dam between Iran and Pakistan because the radical group thought the local was pro-American support, meaning since within that dam there is actually a base where U.S. military personnel and anybody affiliated with the United States government is actually within that base, which is why the radical group killed this innocent man. So therefore, we have to do something, which means we are going to implement the following plan. The United States federal government, through an act of Congress, will end the war on terror, also known as the Overseas Contingency Operation, by discontinuing all U.S. military from Afghanistan and all drone strikes. Again, the United States federal government, through an act of Congress, will end the war on terror, also known as the Overseas Contingency Operation, by discontinuing all U.S. military from Afghanistan and all drone strikes. The funding and enforcement for this plan will be through normal means, meaning, of course, it would have to go through the Congress and so on and so forth. The fourth observation will be the solvency, is what the plan does to solve for all these problems. Is the first point is that we solve the amount of drone strikes enacted in various countries in the Middle East, such as Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The second point is that we actually decrease the possibility of creating radical groups by eliminating the number of U.S. military presence and U.S. presence as a whole. The advantage one, which is decreasing drone strikes. First is that drone strikes have been known to increase the amount of bystander deaths. The A point under this is that according to the Washington Post, only 2% of drone strikes actually take out threats, whereas 98% is actually implemented on innocent people. The two under this, the two is with plan, we would be able to completely remove the ability to continue drone strikes within these regions, such as particularly in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. The 3 point under this is this would decrease the amount of drone strikes put on innocent civilians. The A point under this is that the amount of psychological distress would give families who are affected to finally begin to recuperate from the attacks. The B point is that this would allow them to prolong their lifespans, for since the drone attacks actually hurt large populations of families, which would actually foster for regional stability. The advantage two is rebuilding. The first, number one, is that drone attacks actually have been disrupting infrastructure. The A point of this is that drones have reportedly struck schools in the past, resulting in extensive damage to educational infrastructure, as well as deaths of dozens of children. Two is that with plan, we remove the United States authority to continue drone attacks and bombings. Three is that without this, communities would not be able to rebuild. The fourth point of this is that some implications is without the plan would mean that actually increased regional instability and infrastructure stability. The A point of this is that a hospital in Afghanistan was bombed by a drone strike in the city of Kandahar, which decreased the amount of available doctors, nurses, and medicine to assist those who were already sick. This is by The Guardian, which means even those who were actually hurt by the drone strikes were unable to actually go to this hospital because the doctors that were able to survive the attack actually fled the scene because they were afraid of more drone strikes. The B point under this is that because of military presence and U.S. presence as a whole, water and electricity has not been able to pass fluidly from the Kannar River, which passes from Afghanistan to Iran and Pakistan from the U.S. forward operating base Boshtik. The C point under this is communities surrounding the river have not had access to water, which was a main resources for water as a whole, and also electricity that's produced by the dam. This means more schools, hospitals, and construction sites would not be able to function unless the U.S. military and U.S. presence is removed from this base as a whole. The fifth point under this and the last point is that once the military is removed, communities will be able to rebuild further lost infrastructure.
My first question for you is that you talk a lot about rebuilding within your second advantage, but who is actually going to conduct and lead the necessary forces that's needed within rebuilding?
The ANSF will continue to rebuild, would assist rebuilding this infrastructure, which is provided through the OCO through the U.S. aid.
So they have the logistics as well as the technology for all the rebuilding that's necessary,
yes.
Right? And then your plan removes all military units. Can you just name some of the units that are removed? What kind of units are removed?
Yes, so any participants under the Department of Defense, such as the United States Marine Corps, Army, Navy, and Air Force.
So you're removing all specialized and non-specialized forces that just simply wears a uniform, right?
Yes.
Okay. And under your first contention, you're saying that drone strike will immediately stop, but however, you're saying that these drone strikes are also unmanned. So how do you guarantee that? If they're unmanned, as long as we have the technology, won't the United States still be able to conduct these drone strikes?
No. So under the OCO right now, they are allowed to engage in drone strikes and enact drone strikes, but the moment that we remove authorization for the OCO to continue this, that means we actually remove the ability to actually engage in drone strikes.
You also talk about a lot of infrastructures being destroyed as a result of these drone campaigns.
Yes.
Does it mean that the United States will be in charge of helping to rebuild these properties that were destroyed as a result of the drone strikes?
No, but efforts have already been made by the ANSF and local communities to rebuild for themselves without the U.S. help.
And is this with or without United States aid entirely?
With U.S. aid.
Okay.
Monetary aid.
So we're providing the logistics behind the rebuilding?
Yes.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
First off page is the first contention. Ending the war on terror will cripple Afghanistan's democratic sustainability. To give you a little bit of background on this argument, Barack Obama's slow but decisive pullout has already negatively impacted Afghanistan's infrastructure. According to the Wall Street Journal on October 10, 2012, the withdrawal of troops in the last year has shut down 5 of the 221 provincial reconstruction teams that are funded by the Overseas Contingency Operation and dispense development aid all over the country. Each team consists of 100 troops with representatives from the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Department of Agriculture to help with the infrastructure projects. The United States, through the provincial reconstruction teams, have spent millions of dollars in building schools, roads, and bridges and irrigation systems. The slow withdrawal is already causing problems for these infrastructure projects, but according to senior Western officials, there's a high level of uncertainty that local administrations will be able to take over even with the gradual withdrawal of U.S. military aid and troops. Second point under this is that despite the approval of Afghan National Security Forces, Obama's Overseas Contingency Operation will reduce the number of ANSF troops from 350,000 to 230,000 by the year 2015. These forces are responsible for general public safety and regular military support. According to the New York Times on December 10, 2012, only one Only one of the 23 Afghani military brigades are able to operate independently without United States troops or help or aid. What happens is when the affirmative plan passes, these provincial reconstruction teams, as well as all of the U.S. support, both monetary and training-wise, as far as the ANSF goes, is immediately pulled out, which means that Afghanistan will no longer receive any sort of monetary aid. All the infrastructure projects that the United States federal government is helping out with will immediately stop. That means no more schools will be built with our help, no more bridges. It'll stop the flow of money because the PRT teams are also responsible for building roads between provinces, which means that this will ultimately lead to an economic collapse when products and money cannot flow from one province to another. It will cripple the economy and the capacity for it to grow, which means that people will forcibly be led into make one of two decisions: either starve to death because they can't feed their family, they can't find a job, and they can't they can't prosper in a dying economy, or they are forced to look for money elsewhere, like groups rebel groups that pay these people to become part of their organizations. But moving on to our second contention, called eliminating the overseas contingency operations will create a power vacuum for multiple countries. A power vacuum is a political term used to describe a vacancy or weakness in the power structure of a nation or region. The danger of the vacuum is that a group that does not have the country or the region's best interests may fill the power before an appropriate new government can be installed. An example can be seen from the Somalia power vacuum in 2012. As the government is attempting to begin a new political process, Al Jazeera reported the UN chief urging nations to send in militaries and material aids to prevent the risk of warlords exploiting a power vacuum after the scheduled change of power. Today, Somalia is still a nation without any outside military support or aid and remains a region of violent ethnic conflicts. Current countries need U.S. support to avoid the power vacuum. According to the New York Times, as of December 2012, there were still broad problems with the Afghanistan National Army and the Afghanistan National Security Forces, which together number 350,000 personnel. These security forces still depend on American air power, communications, intelligence gathering, logistics, and leadership. These U.S. aid and U.S. aid to Afghanistan is necessary to maintain stability to their domestic political infrastructure. So the counterplan. The United States federal government, through an act of Congress, will end the war on terror, also known as the Overseas Contingency Operation, by discontinuing all U.S. military units from Afghanistan and all drone strikes, except for those units providing advisory and training support for the Afghan National Security Force. Look, this creates a new amount of solvency when we can. This creates new solutions to all the problems that have arisen in the debate today. We solve for the amount of drone strikes because we're pulling out all the military units that are responsible for these, but also we're keeping all of the aid that is necessary to keep Afghanistan's infrastructure healthy and progressive. And this means that we get to keep on rebuilding these schools and allow enough transition time from the U.S. military pullout for Afghanistan governments and administrations to create stable political structures as well as infrastructures and economy. This solves for all of the negative impacts that we described to you in our first and second contentions. But move on to the affirmatives case. They make the argument on their point 4 that they're solving for drone strikes, but we tell you that we also solve for drone strikes with the counter plan. As far as their dam, even if they remove all of the U.S. military, how are they ever going to be able to solve for the removal of the dam, right? They offer no way or no person or actor to remove the dam for them, which means it still stays there even if they pull out military units. But onto their planned solvency, so we also solve for drone strikes, but however, with their argument that they decrease the possibility of radical groups, we actually increase better because we're actually leaving the units and the support and aid that helps rebuild all the damage that has been caused through this war on terror. So we solve better for these radical movements.
Okay, you stated with one of your contentions that there are problems with the ANSF. Can you elaborate on one point what ANSF is having problems with?
Right. So when the overseas contingency operation pulls out because of your plan. It pulls out all of the military aid that the United States federal government is giving to the ANSF forces, which includes training for their military personnel.
That's not what I asked. You already said in one of your contentions said that right now ANSF is already experiencing problems.
Right. No, what I said in my background on the first contention was that because of the gradual pullout that's already been happening since 2008, they have been experiencing problems, and the immediate pullout because of your plan will lead to bigger impacts.
Okay, the next question is that you said local admins would actually take over. Who are these local admins?
Local administrations, like the Afghani citizens, the Afghani representatives that are elected democratically to represent their people.
How is that bad?
That's not bad. We're saying that that's good, but they need more time because right now they aren't capable of taking care of it themselves.
How many ANSF are actually trained by the United States at a time?
How many are trained at a time?
Yeah.
So right now they're training 23 brigades, and only one of the 23 are fully functional.
Onto your counterplan, you're saying that you're gonna maintain units. What are these units?
So the advisory and the training units that are provided to the ANSF by...
Who are these units?
So just like in the provincial reconstruction teams, representatives from the State Department, representatives from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as representatives from the U.S.
And all these departments are still under the United States, right?
Right.
Okay. And you said, could you re-explain the Somalia power vacuum? How essentially, could you explain that for me again?
So we see that power vacuums are created when, just like in a scenario right now where the U.S. is helping the Afghanistan government rebuild itself. And so when the U.S. leaves so abruptly and takes out all of its aid that includes training and monetary aid, there's a vacuum created, just like how in Somalia there was one last year, which means that rebel groups or groups that don't have the state's best interest take over the government.
Okay, thank you.
Starting on their counterplan, I'm going to make three big arguments on their counterplan. First of all, their counterplan is leaving American troops in Afghanistan, and this is what's going to link them to a bunch of disadvantages to their counterplan because the presence of American troops increases radicalism. According to the New York Times, the presence of U.S. military troops in regions throughout the Middle East increases sympathies for radical organizations and increases membership in these organizations. And this is something that they are not going to be solving for when they leave troops in Afghanistan. Something they neglect to realize is progress that has been made in Afghanistan. This was also reported by the New York Times that in areas where United States troops have pulled out completely, violence in these regions has radically decreased, support for ANSF has increased, and membership and sympathy for radical groups has also decreased. And these areas have also started their own reconstruction projects to rebuild their own infrastructure. And with the decrease in violence, there's been an overall increase in rebuilding infrastructure because of the decrease in violence, the infrastructure is not getting destroyed. So on to my second argument is that they also neglect the fact in their arguments on our counterplan that the United States under our plan the United States is going to continue financial aid to Afghanistan, and also our plan does not remove NATO forces that are currently in Afghanistan. And these NATO forces have been slowly filling the void that U.S. troops have left and have been training NSFA troops. So on to their contentions. On their first contentions, they basically say that the United States is going to pull out and that this is going to collapse infrastructure building. However, you can look to the example I just gave you, where in areas where U.S. troops have pulled out, there's actually been an increase in rebuilding and a decrease in radicalism in these areas. Also, they say that ANSF is not going to be able to operate once the U.S. withdraws. However, please look to the fact that NATO is currently taking over the training of ANSF individuals, and also currently 85% of the training for ANS individuals is done by Afghanis, not by the United States, but by Afghanis. So this training will continue even as with the plan, and also just look to the fact again that we are still providing funding to Afghanistan. We're not removing all funding. And also, they say that this is going to stop schools and stops roads being built. However, when you see a decrease in violence, a decrease in radicalism, the rebuilding of the infrastructure is actually going to be improved because it's not going to be destroyed by violence. On to their second contention, the power vacuum. The biggest argument I want to make on this page is that they don't provide any time frame for how long the United States needs to be in Afghanistan for no power vacuum to occur. They also went so far as to say that countries need U.S. military presence in order to have a democratic or stable government. However, first of all, they're not looking to the advances that have been made by the Afghani people themselves. They're also assuming that the Afghanis are not going to be able to control their own country. Also, the power vacuum is only going to be made worse with the presence of U.S. troops when you have these sympathies for radical groups. And these radical groups are the ones they're saying that are going to come into the governments and take over and do bad things. So when you withdraw U.S. military troops, you're going to be allowing for the Afghanis to establish their own government, and you're going to be decreasing sympathies for these radical groups. On to just the arguments he made on how on the dams. The dam in the area that he was talking about, this is actually a dam that was originally used by Native individuals in this area, and was kind of taken over by U.S. military bases. And this kind of harm is not going to be solved by their counterplan, because their counterplan leaves military bases, it leaves military personnel in Afghanistan. So you're still going to be having all these harms where villagers aren't going to have access to water, aren't going to have access to power. And so this still remains. And quickly on solvency, they say that they solve better. But however, please cross-apply my examples where I stated earlier that in regions where U.S. military personnel are present regardless of what these personnel are doing, there's increased sympathy for terrorist organizations, and this can be seen in examples across the Middle East. So in this debate round, you're going to be voting for me and Barbara, because our plan provides the most solvency by pulling out United States troops entirely, and in this way decreasing radicalism in Afghanistan and allowing for Afghani individuals to rebuild their country in a less violent manner. And also just note too that we still are providing funding for rebuilding of infrastructure, but this rebuilding won't be carried out by U.S. military personnel.
I have one question. My first question is the antagonism specifically directed at forces like the provincial reconstruction teams? The antagonism created by these rebel groups.
So like increased membership, is it?
So I mean the negative feeling, the anti-Americanist emotions that arise, those directly related to the...
It's been tied to the presence of all U.S. military personnel regardless of their function. So even in areas where it's not necessarily combat personnel, there's still been an increase in anti-American sentiments with, I guess you would label them support personnel.
All right, awesome. Could you also clarify exactly what your plan does as far as funding goes when you're pulling out all military personnel? Because with me, I have your plan text just saying that it pulls out military units and all drone strikes, but it says nothing about the funding.
The funding would stay in place as it currently is under U.S. aid, and it would continue to be distributed to Afghanistan through their government, and also through the funding we provide to NATO and then the NATO support troops.
Okay, so would you take out the provincial reconstruction teams because they are funded by the overseas contingency operation?
We'd take out all military personnel.
So
if they were
including
military personnel, yes.
Okay, awesome. And what was the study that you cited again that talked about these anti-American sentiments?
There was two I cited. One was from the Washington Post and one was from the New York Times.
The New York Times,
yeah.
Okay. And those were not directly related to like these specialized units that offer aid, right? And aren't actually
the one from
aggressive.
The one from the Washington Post cited that there was an increase in anti-American sentiments regardless of the capacity of the troops. So even if they were not combat troops, there was still an increase in anti-American sentiments.
Awesome, thank you.
You're going to be voting for Jesus Nye in this debate because the plan itself does not provide for the rebuilding forces necessary to help these nations to actually rebuild after the devastations caused by the drone campaigns as the effect of the United States. Specifically in the background of the affirmative, Barbara really goes for this point where radical group sympathies are increased as a result of the United States military personnel being on the nation's soil. However, to this aspect of the debate, I have 4 things to address. The first is that the radical group actually uses anti-American sentiments as a way of recruiting for more people. And this is according to now, my number 2 point is that according to the State's Department's Annual Patterns of Global Terrorism report, the issue of terrorism and anti-American sentiments are too complicated by itself to indicate any direct correlation. So therefore, even if you look at Emily and Barbara's UCLA analysis, directing the two together, the analysis is shaky at best. My third argument towards this is that radical groups are especially anti-American because they want to fill the power vacuum and fill that void that's being taken away after the United States troops actually pull out. And this is why they are especially anti-American, because they want the ability to take over after the United States are gone. My 4th point under this is that rebuilding forces such as the Provincial Reconstruction Team are sent across the world annually for natural disasters and nation emergencies and has not caused any anti-American sentiments to increase. So therefore, these anti-American sentiments are not especially directed like rebuilding forces such as the PRT teams. So moving on to the plan itself. On the plan, Barbara and Emily claims 2 major solvencies. The first is the decrease of the drone strikes. I want you to notice that the counterplan also provides a solution to stop drone strikes because we also end the campaign itself. The second under the solvency is that they say it's going to decrease the radical groups. However, I'm going to say that their way of taking away all military unit actually fuels radical groups and instead of try to decrease them, because according to the Princeton Review report in late 2012, terrorism acts are actually increased in countries such as India and Jordan, where there's no U.S. military presence, which means that this just proves our point of the power vacuum happening, because these radical groups are actually eager to go into these nations and take over the powers when the United States militaries are away. And this only fosters more terrorism acts to occur if all teams are taken away. Moving on to their advantage 1 of drone strikes. First of all, I want you to also see that the counterplan solves for the decreased drone strikes, because we will also be stopping all drone campaigns that's being conducted right now. Specifically on their 3rd point, Emily and Barbara tells you that it's going to decrease the psychological tension caused on individuals. However, I'm going to say that their way of pulling away all military personnel does not actually provide any solutions for solving for psychological tension, because the tension, as my opponents have explained to you, resulted because affected individuals aren't able to go to work and provide for their family. So without the Provincial Reconstruction teams to rebuild these dams, to rebuild these shops, to rebuild these strong businesses and education for schools, there's actually no psychological tension relief provided as a result of the drone strikes. On their advantage 2 of rebuilding, my opponents specifically tell you about the water dams. However, we're saying that the PRT teams are actually helping to rebuild these necessary infrastructures in order for the citizens within these nations to get necessary resources. In addition, I want you to apply our arguments in contention 2, where we tell you that the security forces within Afghanistan especially still depend on the United States for air power, communication, intelligence gathering, logistics, and leadership. So therefore, the technology itself within Afghanistan right now, it's not able to stand independently on itself and still needs the United States help and United States personnel's directions on how to use these technologies in order to provide any solution for rebuilding. So, which is why the counterplan actually addresses the notion of rebuilding better than the plan itself. Moving on to the counterplan, Emily's biggest argument, again, is the increased sympathy for radical groups. However, apply my analysis on their background, where I tell you that there's actually 4 points that's actually going against this, specifically that they're actually fueling this radical groups by pulling all units away because radical groups now have the power to take over. Moving out to our contention 1, Emily specifically tell you that aid continues. However, even if some kind of aid still continues due to humanitarian efforts, however, the large amount of funding for infrastructure operations are taken away because they're funded through the OCO for the PRT teams. So therefore, the fundings will still be taken away as a result of the teams being taken away. And additionally, in contention 2, Emily tells you that we're actually assuming these teams are not able to operate on its own. I want you to apply our contention 1 analysis, where Jesus tells you that according to the New York Times, only 1 out of 23 Afghani military are able to operate independently without the United States troops. So therefore, we provide you with empirical evidence how the counterplan is actually the best way to address the necessary problems that we're seeing today with the devastation caused by the drone campaigns. And the only way that you're going to provide for any solution is through voting for Jesus and I with the counterplan.
You said that as the United States pulls out, there's going to be an increase in radicalism. How do you explain the actual events that have taken place that in regions where the U.S. has pulled out, there's been a decrease in radicalism and a decrease in sympathy for these groups?
So first of all, I'm going to refer you to my analysis where, according to the State Department, the 2 issues on itself is actually too complicated to be directly correlated with each other. Secondarily, on top of that, if you look at nations such as Morocco and Jordan, where there's no military presence within it or any military support given to them, there's actually an increase in radical groups as a result of them without any facilitating them.
But we're looking specifically at Afghanistan, and in Afghanistan there's been this decrease, which would seem to contradict most of your analysis that you put on our case.
The decrease in sympathy is only temporary because there's still military forces operating on the soil of Afghanistan right now. So therefore, if you take away all military forces, then it's only going to be a sharp increase and a power vacuum occurring.
And can I ask you, I just want to ask for one clarification question. What do you mean by they use anti-American sentiments to increase participation in their groups?
Antagonism, this is typically filled through nationalism. For example, if you are Afghani, then you won't be supporting any United States troops. This draws a dichotomy between the 2 peoples that are attempting to work together within one nation's soil.
Okay, and that's all my questions.
I'll be giving a brief overview of all of the speeches and arguments that have come out in the debate, and then I'd like to move on to their background and their plan, and then move on to our counter plan, our contention 1, and our contention 2. Is everyone ready? Perfect. Okay. You're going to be voting for Carol and I in this debate for 3 big reasons. First of all, any problems that they can address through the plan are also addressed through the counter plan, and we also avoid more of the negative implications that we bring up in both of our contentions. Second off, they not only don't solve for the problems that have arisen in our first contention and our second contention, but they also make these problems worse by removing all U.S. military aid to Afghanistan instantaneously by passing their plan. And so I'll show you exactly how our counter plan functions and what world you'll be seeing with our counter plan and what sort of world you'll be looking forward to by passing their plan. But move on to their background. Look. Bottom line here is that their plan does not provide the necessary rebuilding support to allow for the reconstruction of the damage that has occurred because of conflicts between the U.S. or any other country and Afghanistan. We tell you that First of all, the radicalism argument is much too complex to be discussed and like have a definite answer in this debate. But also, we give you the argument that anti-American sentiment will only increase when we instantaneously remove all sort of funding and military aid to the Afghanistan government. That eventually leads to the crippling of their infrastructure as well as their economy. But move on down to the big argument here is that the provincial reconstruction teams are funded by the overseas contingency operation that they are removing by passing plan. When we tell you that this gradual change from and transition from the U.S. Helping the Afghani government get on their feet and the Afghani government taking over on their own is crucial to avoid the crippling of their economy and to avoid this power vacuum that can lead to the destruction of Afghanistan as a nation and as a democratic political structure. This is key, and this is the biggest argument that you're going to be voting for in this debate. But move on to their solvency points. Of their plan. Look, extend our argumentation here. There really are no arguments here that are contentious, because we solve for all of the drone strikes, because we take out the military personnel that are responsible for this. But also, we decrease the amount of negative American sentiment, if we can quantify that, because we are the provincial reconstruction teams that are funded right now currently through the overseas contingency operation are helping to rebuild. This is something that completely goes uncontested in this debate and that you need to evaluate thoroughly. When the PRT teams are helping build irrigation systems to get water to people who desperately need it, when they're rebuilding schools, when they're building roads, when they're building hospitals, and we've given you evidence that say that these teams cannot fully function without U.S. support. Pulling the U.S. support instantaneously, it creates an immediately ceases all of this production that creates a more positive and healthy infrastructure to Afghanistan. So moving on to our counterplan. Look, our counterplan provides all of the amount of solvency, it solves for all of the negative implications that the affirmative team, Barbara and Emily, bring up, as well as it solves for our second two contentions. When we move on to our first contention of ending the war, of how ending the war on terror will cripple Afghanistan's democratic sustainability. Bottom line here is that they don't address the negative implications that arose from this contention, and they don't have the capacity to solve for the plan. In their world, there is a possibility and a risk of a power vacuum being created and rebel groups taking over Afghanistan, as well as the crippling of domestic infrastructure of Afghanistan that puts millions of people at a disadvantage to education. In our world, we solve for all of that. So you're going to prefer the counterplan.
You're clearly going to be voting for Emily for the following three reasons. First of all, the counterplan does not solve for the radical groups as much as we do on a magnitude level, because we decrease the probability of the power vacuum, specifically when we've already seen the regions that have no U.S. military presence actually gaining some sort of reconstruction and rebuilding because of the decrease of radical groups. Second of all, you're going to be voting for us because the plan solves much better for the infrastructure on a magnitude level too, because we recreate the economy specifically when they don't argue or don't completely disregard the NATO analysis and also the US aid still being funded to the ANSF. Third of all, you're going to be voting for us because the plan is the only one that solves for the fluidity of water on a time frame level, probability level, and a magnitude level when we allow for this water to go into Pakistan and Iran and not just be blocked into Afghanistan. So first, the background. I'm going to be grouping all the analysis that Carol gave you about the radical anti-Semitism into the counterplan, which is where we're going right now. Onto the counterplan. First, I want you to look at the analysis that Emily first gave you onto the counterplan, which says that the New York Times has already stated that areas who have already pulled out of any U.S. presence or U.S. military has actually already seen decreasing violence, actually increase more support for the ANSF, and also decrease some sort of radical support. And so therefore, we can see specifically that only through the plan we're able to see this already happening right now. When Carol or Jesus don't go onto this analysis, we can see this as true, which means that the plan is already solving right right now. Secondly, I want you to look at the analysis that Emily gave you, where the United States is still continuing the financial aid. Carol and Jesus completely misunderstand the analysis that we gave you with the OCO still provides funding directly to ANSF through USAID, and any PR funding that is given from OCO is a separate type of funding, which means that money would still be given to ANSF. That means we still solve better for the infrastructure. Also, any onto the arguments that, let me see. Oh, the analysis that Carol gave through cross-checks that the specifically decreasing the amount of radical support is only temporary. However, we've already seen this being this decrease in support radicalism have already been going on for 2 years, meaning we've already solved for that much better. Going to the power vacuum argument, specifically, you want to look at the analysis I had already given you within the counterplan, that the moment we've already seen the decrease of radical groups because we remove U.S. presence means the power vacuum is not happening already, which means we don't actually lead into the power vacuum analysis. Going into the solvency argument, I want you to look at the analysis that Emily first gave you, that the counterplan does not actually solve for the dam analysis. Specifically, when the moment that you go for counterplan, that shows that the U.S. military presence or the PR groups would be stationed at the base that was established in the beginning of our case, which means this dam would not be able to provide water to Iran or Pakistan. The moment that we remove through the plan U.S. presence or U.S. military, this water would be given all throughout Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, which means we solve much better for the water than they do. Onto the rebuilding, I want you to look at the analysis specifically of how this water actually provides electricity. The moment that the plan actually removes any U.S. presence or military for that matter, this water and the dam specifically creates electricity that allows for reconstruction to be more probable within Afghanistan. So the moment that we're able to maintain this electricity shows why we're able to solve for the reconstruction and re-infrastructure within these regions much better than they do and much faster. Also, any of the analysis that they gave you onto their first contention. The only argument I want you to look at is the dropped analysis that Emily gave, that NATO does already 80% of the training for ANSF, which means even if we remove all U.S. military personnel and presence as a whole, the ANSF would still maintain training, which means any crippling of the democracy within this region would still be maintained, which we solve much better, much faster, and way better than they do as a whole.